Hello everyone, welcome to GOAT. This is Jeremy and today we're going to be learning about condition coding, if statements. So this works for all of VBA, whether you're in Excel or Access or anything else. And we're only going to be going over multiple types of ifs, and we'll show you a couple of tricks and caveats. My name's Jeremy, thanks so much for joining. If you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe if you find this channel useful, and also be sure to check out the playlists because as the videos grow, we organize everything into playlists. So let's get started. So let's take a look at our first example, which is probably the most simple if statement we can make. So first we give ourselves a constant x. This and sign after it means it's an integer, and with VBA you can assign the value of a constant on the same line. So that's what we do. We do constant x equals 1. And then here's our if statement. If x equals 1, then, so if this evaluates to true, perform this one or more steps underneath. Message box x equals 1, and then an end if. So let's run this. Test if underscore 1. We have a pop-up box. Now I'm in Access just because I'm more comfortable with it, but this also works in Excel. So that's our most simple if statement. Here's our second example of an if statement. Now this is a single line if statement. This is only usable if you have one step following the then. So we give ourselves a constant x as before. If x equals 1, then message box x equals 1. Now notice, even though I indented this, maybe I accidentally indented this, this is a separate line of code that will keep running. So it's essential that you don't confuse that. Some people do not like the single line if, or maybe they'll put a space in between so that way they can tell it apart from the other code. But let's go ahead and run this, and you'll see what I mean. So test if11, we get the message box, x equals 1, and now the debug print comes down here. So it executes whatever this code is and then jumps down to this code. It continues on. That is a single line if statement. Our next example is a chained single line if statement. So now I have variables x and y, and I set their values. If x equals 1, then if y equals 2, then. So all of these have to assess as being true, and then it will message box. And so let's test it out. If, and there we have it, x equals 1 and y equals 2. So that's, you can actually chain these multiple times. I only do them maybe one additional time. It's very useful in Access, especially. I have a custom function for throwing error messages or checking for user responses, and this is a single line chained if statement is a really nice way to pull that off. I won't cover that in this video, but maybe in a future episode. Now here's an example of that chain single line if where I do multiple if-thens. This is not recommended. It gets really hard to read. You should break this up into multiple lines or maybe nest your ifs. So for instance, if x equals 1, then you could do something like this. Now if you do that, you're going to have to close out this end if that belongs to the x, and that's why tabs are important, just to keep your spacing proper. So let's go ahead and run this, and then it ran properly. Now what happens if you try to single line if, since you only have one statement, you don't do the end if, but you happen to put this statement on the second line. This will error out. So let's do test if underscore 11, block if without end if. It's calling you. Now, there is a trick in VBA. If you want to continue a line of code and it is not in the middle of a string, you can do space and underscore. That is if, for instance, this line was really long and then you wanted to keep doing one line, you could do space underscore. Now it will actually work. So that's something to keep in mind in case you run across code that uses this trick. Now here's a simple if statement with multiple lines. Remember, you can have one or more lines after the then, as long you'll have to close it out with an end if. So if x equals 1, then, and it's going to run both of these lines of code. So we're going to do it. And there we have both lines of code run within the if block here. VBA supports multiple operators, and the OR is one of them. So if x equals 0 or x equals 1, then we give ourselves a message box. So if we run test if underscore 2, then we're going to get that message box because one of these was true. So that's the OR statement. Now here's a big warning. Make sure you do not do this. So if you put in parentheses, if x equals 1 or 0, you're going to get some really weird results. So you would imagine that this would evaluate to true, but if we run it, you'll see that it doesn't do it. So or like this will not work. You want to make sure you use the previous example, which is you evaluate x twice. You evaluate x equals 0, then x equals 1 as a complete statement. Here's the AND operator, whereas the OR operator, either one of those could be true, and all of the AND chains have to be true. So if x equals 0 and x equals 1, then we message box. Obviously, this will fail, and just to make ourselves feel better, we'll try it, and of course, we didn't get the message box. So this did not assess to true. Here's how you do a simple if with a Boolean. We have a constant x as Boolean equals true. We go ahead and set the value on that same line. If x equals true, then message box x equals true. So let's do a test if _4 and x equals true. Now here's an example where we can shorten that. Instead of saying if x equals true, we can just say if x, which really helps with code if you have a lot of Boolean operators. If x, then message box x equals true. We run it, and x is true. Now this is the XOR, and basically if the expressions conflict, the statement is true. It evaluates to true. So I rarely use this, but I want to show you just in case you ever need it. So if x equals 2 or x equals 1, now do these expressions conflict? Yes, because this will be false and this will be true. So this should print if x equals 1 or x equals 2. Yes, those conflict, so this should print x equals 1, true. XOR x equals 1, that's also true. This should not print. X equals 2 is false. XOR x equals 2 is false. This should also not print. So when we run the code, we see that it only prints XOR 1 and XOR 2 because those conflicted. Those expressions conflicted, therefore that evaluated to true. Now here's a more complex if statement where we have an else in there. So if x equals 0, then we do this. Else, if x does not equal 0, we do this. So we're going to go ahead and run this code here, and you'll see what happens. X equals 1, so it jumped down to the else statement because this evaluated as false, so then it ran whatever is in the else. Now I'm going to show you an alternative to do this. Notice how this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. If we only need to evaluate two conditions, either 0 or not 0, we could also do it this way. So I'm at 6a, so let's go to 6b. So this is an alternative to that where we only use two lines. If x equals 0, then exit sub. If x equals 1, then debug.print. Now, if x equals something like 2 or 3 or not 0 or 1, then none of these will run. So you have to be aware of that. But if you want to evaluate and do an action, whether x equals 1 or x equals 0, this is a shorter way to do it. It's only 2 lines versus 5. What you have to be careful of is doing something like this. So I gave myself y, a Boolean. Now by default, y is going to be false. So if not y, then y equals true. So I made y equals true, and then if you're not careful, it'll jump down to this next line, and you're not expecting it to run, but it will run. So we're going to go ahead and run this code, and we'll see that it ran, yep, debug x is 1, so it didn't exit the sub, and then it ran this. And so you have to be really careful that you don't change the value of y to this next expression here if you don't mean to. Now here's an if, then else if statement here. Now this is where you can just jump to assessing something completely different. So for instance, if x equals 1, then debug x1, here's my code. Now this will remember the first statement it gets to is true. It will go ahead and run that code and then exit the complete if block. So let's go ahead and run this here. X equals 1. So it ran this. Even though this is true, it exited the if block. Now let's do if x is not equal 1. How do you think this is going to run? Y is 5 is the correct answer because this evaluated to false. If we do this here, we can give ourselves an else. We don't have to, but we can to error out of that, or not error out, just to assess neither value, and it jumped down to the I quit. And again, you can put multiple lines in here because this is a proper if block. Now here's an example of a single line if, serial if that's kind of useful. So single line chain if. So if x equals 1, then, and I have my custom function here that's going to ask me to continue or not. I call it rUserStop. And here you can see the code down here. So if x equals 1, then if rUserStop, and I pass it the warning message, then exit sub. Otherwise, it's going to give me a message box to continue. That's a really compact way to ask for a user input and then halt if they don't answer appropriately. So let's run test if _1 _3. Warning, x equals 1, continue. Now if I hit no, it will exit, as we see. If I hit yes, it's going to run that message box, decided to continue. So that's kind of a useful way. I use this all the time with a custom function in Access. I have a table of error codes I can look up. Now you can nest if statements, and here is a simple nested if statement. I give myself x equals 1, y equals 100, and then here is the code. Now can you guess which line will be output? I'll give you a few seconds. Pause the video if you want. Line C. So x was greater than or equal to 1. Okay, so now we've assessed this as true. We're going to enter this if block. That was false. Else if. That is also false. Else. Line C. I gave myself an else. I didn't have to. I could have ended it with an end if. And then this else, remember, belongs to this up here. So if constant x equals 0, then what would happen was line D would print because it would skip all of this. So nested ifs can get quite dirty. Sometimes you have to rewrite your code to make it easy because Boolean operators and nested ifs and whatnots can be very confusing when your code gets very complex. Here's another example of how these nested if statements and multiple expressions and operators can get a little bit hairy. I give myself x equals 10, y equals 11, and bt. Which line do you think will pop up when I run this code? You can pause the video if you want to look at the code. Let's run it. Line C. So notice I have sets of parentheses here. If x is not equals 10 or y equals 11, so that would normally evaluate to true. However, I have that wrapped around an AND statement. X plus y does not equal 22, it equals 21. So both of these have to evaluate to true to enter this block, which they do not. So it hops down to the if else if x equals 10, which it does, prints out line C. Folks, that's all for today. I hope you enjoy. Again, practice, practice, practice. Further videos will get more into other things such as select case, switch statements, and immediate ifs. Have a great day and God bless.